This is Howard County's fiscal year 22 Spending Affordability Advisory Committee. So today is February the 4th. We have a few important things on the agenda. We will start by a finance presentation by Nikki, our investment and debt manager, about debt affordability. And then our budget office will provide a fiscal outlook. And following that will be colleagues from DPZ Planning Department and also the consultant to talk about long-term demographic trends, development trend, and also some scenarios approach for the general plan update. So I'll start with Nikki. Nikki, were you able to share the screen?
Good morning. Yes, now I can. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sure. Okay, so as Holly mentioned, my name is Nikki Griffith. I'm in the Department of Finance and I handle all things debt for the county. So some of the things I'm going to discuss today is the county's credit rating. Also, as required by the charter, I'll share with you the current debt measures per the debt management policy. I'll also go over the projections for where we believe the debt measures will be going forward. I'll briefly go over the bond authorization process and a topic that the committee has asked about a lot is authorized but unissued bonds. Okay, so Howard County has received the highest rating, AAA, from the three major credit rating agencies for the past 23 years. And actually just yesterday, we confirmed the AAA with a stable outlook with all three credit rating agencies again. So that's now 24. So we are planning to issue bonds later this month, and so we went and met with the rating agencies to get an updated credit rating. Some of the things that County Executive Ball's transition team recommended going forward was, of course, to continue to focus on the county's AAA bond rating, since it allows us to borrow at the lowest possible cost. So our financial advisor had estimated that for a $150 million bond sale, by having a AAA rating, it would save the county over $1 million in interest costs over the 20-year life of the bonds. The second recommendation from the fiscal recommendation from County Ball's transition team was that we should prepare for a downturn in the economy or a revenue shortfall and increase the rainy day funds or funds that are set aside. It's almost like they had a premonition that COVID was coming. But we have been consciously, as a county, trying to focus on increasing our reserve funds, not only because of economic reasons, but also because of the two floods in Ellicott City that we're still dealing with the FEMA. So now just a little bit about the credit rating criteria. The credit analysis measures what they consider the ability and willingness of an entity to meet their financial obligations. Each agency publishes a very detailed methodology listing all of the credit factors that they will consider. They're all slightly different. They look at it slightly different ways. But overall, there are four major areas that they look at. The economy and the tax base, which is always very good for the county, as we're a wealthy county with well-educated, well-paid residents. It also goes over the finances, also the management. The county always gets a very high rating for management because we have a lot of long-term fiscal policies in place that we adhere to. And then the final one is debt and pensions. And again, the county does very well in the pension category because our pensions are both very well funded. And then over here is a little graphic that just shows you how the credit ratings play out with each of the rating agencies. Again, AAA being the highest, and anything below a BAA is considered non-investment grade. So here's a little more detail on the fund balance criteria. So you can see from the chart to the right that the county has hovered around 13%, 12%, and just in FY20, we did have more income tax revenues than expected, and so we did set that aside. So the fund balance did increase to 18%, which if you look over to the left, you can see that previously the amount of fund balance that the county had put us in a single A category. So we've now moved up to the double A category. And this year, also with S&P, we've moved up into the very strong category. So again, the focus on increasing the fund balance was to be more consistent with the median for AAAs. And also just wanted to point out that per the county charter, only the unassigned balance is available for just one-time expenditures. It cannot be used for ongoing operating expenditures. So now we move on to the debt measures. So the first measure is debt as a percent of assessable base. So the assessable base has continued to increase on a regular basis, about 3%. And our outstanding general obligation debt has also been increasing. So you can see it's gone from 2.1% to 2.29%. And then this is where we project this measure will go going forward. So let me talk about the assumptions quickly. So we're assuming that for the next 2 years, about 75 million would be authorized in bonds, general obligation bonds, that going forward after that 2-year period, it would be 90 million of annual authorization. We're also assuming a rather high 4.5% interest rate, but again, we're projecting for 10 years down the road, so we try to be very conservative. Also, I mentioned we're issuing bonds later this month. We are going to be issuing the 75 million milestone payment for the courthouse P3. So that's included in this projection. We're also projecting to get a WIFIA loan. So that's a water infrastructure financing loan from the EPA. We were recently selected to submit the application to meet all the requirements to get this federal loan. It has very favorable repayment terms, which is why we were considering it. We are allowed to delay repayment until the work is completed. Normally we start issuing bonds and paying debt throughout the period. The rates are also fantastic. They're based on the slugs rate, which is the state and local government securities rate that's established by the Treasury. So currently, as of yesterday, the rate was 1.89%. So definitely well below the 4.5% that we normally forecast. And then we're also assuming that the balance of the authorized but unissued bonds would begin to come down and be issued through FY 2027. So you can see here that based on all these assumptions, that we would expect that the assessable base would continue to increase. We do have the outstanding GO debt would peak around 2027 and then begin to decline after that period. And so you can see that the maximum debt as a percent of assessable base is about 2.32%, which we predict is this current fiscal year that we're in. So our second debt measure is debt against the percent of the skipped ahead there. Debt measured against the population on a per capita basis. So you can see that the county's population has been increasing and that the debt per capita has also been increasing. And this is not a measure that's considered by the credit rating agencies, but it is still part of the debt management policy that we report to the committee. And then our third measure is per capita debt measured as a percent of the per capita income. So a limit of 10% was considered consistent with AAA rated counties back when it was added to the policy in 1996. So this measure is not considered by the credit rating agencies, but we do report it to you. And it just shows that the per capita income has been increasing for county residents, and a debt as a percent of income has slowly been increasing, but is definitely below the 10% policy limit. Then our final debt measure is debt service as a percent of current revenues. So the county's self-imposed policy goal is to keep debt service to 10% of or less of current revenues. And this measure is considered part of S&P's credit rating. You can see that the debt service, again, has been increasing over the past 5 years, but the revenues have also been increasing. And you can see that the debt as a percent of revenue also has been increasing through this time period. And just a little note that the current revenues include all of the general fund revenues, the environmental services fund, which is the trash fee, and also the fire tax fund. All those taxes and revenues are included in the revenues. And then you can see going forward that we do expect that the debt service as a percent of current revenues will increase. It will peak, we believe, around 2024. Again, it was based on the assumptions that I mentioned on the several slides previously. And I do just want to point out that it does include the WIFIA loan debt. It also includes the capital charge that will be paid to the P3 concessionaire beginning in FY22. Several of the rating agencies include that in their debt metrics. So we just wanted to be consistent with how they were calculating and viewing the debt. It is not a general obligation of the county, but it is something that they consider in our rating. So now we'll move on to the bond authorization and issuance process. So bonds are authorized in conjunction with the adoption of the capital budget. So based on what is included in the executive proposed capital budget, we then prepare bond authorization legislation. It's linked to specific capital projects, and to move it between projects requires legislative action. Once the bonds are authorized, the authorization is in effect for 4 years. They can be reauthorized again during the capital budget process if all of the bonds have not been issued at that point. And generally, our historic flow is that we issue about 20% of the annual authorization per year. So generally, there will be some reauthorizations in there because it takes 5 years for us to spend down all the funds. The way that the county charter, it requires us to authorize the full amount of the project at the onset, because when the generally Public Works signs a contract for the construction, the Director of Finance is required to certify that that funding authorization is available. So it's a little different than at the state where they can just authorize as they go. For the county, we have to authorize the full amount of the borrowing at the onset. The county also has a short-term line of credit that we generally use to assist our cash flow, and we reimburse ourselves throughout the year, and then that will be paid off when bonds are issued. So again, we're issuing bonds this month, and we'll pay off about $70 million that we currently have outstanding on our line of credit. So this is just tracking the authorized but unissued bonds. We know that this has been a concern of the committee and finance, along with Public Works and budget. We did an in-depth review and worked with all the departments to try to eliminate any authorized bonds that were not going to be needed on projects. So you can see it had been declining. But there are several big projects that did cause some increases in the out years here. Of course, that would be the courthouse bonds down here near the bottom. Originally, it was 105 million that was authorized, but we will not be issuing that much. It's going to be down closer to the 86 million. And also just last year, there were bonds authorized for the Cultural Center in downtown Columbia. Again, those will primarily be paid from incremental property tax revenues in that area, not from general fund property taxes or general revenues. And just also to note that last year, of the 396 million in outstanding GO bonds, over 40% of that, or 166 million, is related to education. And part of that was due to this new school transfer tax bonds. So last year, the council approved an increase to the transfer tax, and additional revenues are then flowing to pay for these transfer tax bonds. So you can see last year, nearly 20 million was authorized for that use. And so last year, it was a 37 million increase in authorized bonds for education over previous years. And then here's just a comparison of the bonds that are authorized each year to the amount of bonds that are issued each year. So you can see that on average, it's the amount issued is less than the amount authorized. So I think that's a positive. So we don't have to assume that the full 396 million will eventually be issued. Hopefully those projects will come in under budget going forward. So that concludes my presentation. If anyone has any questions.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I'll start by congratulating our finance department for maintaining the AAA. I mean, the county has always been doing good on that, but in such an economic uncertainty pandemic, it's actually still a very big achievement to maintain that. So thank you very much. So we're open to questions here. If anyone have questions for Nikki or the rest of the friends from finance, please just unmute yourself.
I'll jump in real quick. One of the issues we brought up last year in our report was using the transfer tax revenues, as I recall, for reducing the amount borrowed rather than leveraging them up and using them as a way to pay off additionally issued bonds. did I hear you say that the council last year made the determination to use them as a form of payment rather than as a form of reducing the principal amount issued?
So I can maybe jump in on that. So the overall GO authorized in fiscal year 21 budget does represent a decrease from historical level. Later, actually, in my presentation, I'll show you. Historically, or at least a few years ago, the county every year authorized close to $95 million in the annual CIP budget. But last year, what the council approved is 70.5 million. So that does represent quite some decrease on that. Transfer tax at this point, most of the time was used as cash pay-go. I think last year we did allow a one-time issuance of self-supported debt from T-Tax to support school project, but that's only a one-time deal. So in general, T-Tax is used on cash pay-go only, not used for bonding.
Holly, this is Steve. But to be clear, it is a one-time deal because it's an increase, and then we have to hope that it continues on a go-forward basis, because transfer tax, although on a regular basis, is repeatable, not always at the same amount based on the economy. So even though the GO bonds were lowered, we did leverage the increase of the transfer tax.
Right.
Which was not, to Todd's point, the recommendation of the committee was because of the variability of transfer tax, we didn't recommend that happen, but that's what was done.
That's accurate, yeah. And by the way, I think the transfer tax was approved, the tax rate increase on that. That's for the audience last year. So any other questions?
I have one question. At the end of the presentation, the last 3 years, and we see the issued bond is over, continuously more than 100% of the allowed amount. So what's the continuous trend? What's the implication of that?
So again, that was the focus on trying to reduce the authorized but unissued bonds. So we've been authorizing less and issuing the previous authorized bonds. So that's how we've helped decrease the outstanding balance.
Yeah, as Nikki mentioned that in her presentation, the natural process between original authorization and actually issue the bond could take typically at least a few years because of the timing. You have the authorization first, so then you have contract, and you do the construction, use line of credit to do short-term borrowing, and finally issue the bond to pay off ourselves on that. So that process itself, usually there's a lagging part. And also historically, before the past a couple of years ago, the county authorized budget, the GO amount was even higher. At some point, it's even beyond $100 million. So some of this already get issued, some are still through the pipeline. So we're still not only dealing with today's authorization, but also some historical authorization that still comes through the pipeline. So typically, each year issuance is more than what's authorized in that year because of that.
I see. Thank you.
Sure.
Good morning, Nikki. This is Milton Matthews. The question I have is that what factors do we use in when it comes to looking at our increase in our assessable base? And I pose that question because we're looking at the availability of new land or redevelopment in Howard County. So what are some of those factors?
So I'm going to defer to Holly, as she's the one that projects the assessable base.
Thank you, Nikki. So Matt, there's a few debt indicators there, which is the government tracking commonly, but also there's a few of them, most of them are being looked at by rating agencies as well. So the debt as a percentage of assessable base is one of them. If we talk about statutory limit there, then the current level using that indicator, we're still way below that. But all those debt indicator, as you can tell, it's trending up. So it's trending up, which is we are keeping an eye on. Assessable base, as you said, is very important. That's our number one source of base for revenues there. In recent years, it has been slowing down. It's maintained a moderate growth, but has been slowing down in general. And looking forward, we do have concerns both from the pandemic on the commercial base and also on the fact that the county is running out of land in the coming decades in terms of development. So later, actually, DPZ will talk about that. So all this is going to constrain the long-term growth of assessable base, which will remain a concern. I think the one point has been made earlier at some of the business panel discussion and other places about the county should continue to find policy or approach, try to maintain or boost assessable base where possible. It will continue to be an ongoing theme, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
If I could,
Probably a quick question. One of the things that was
go ahead.
Was just said was that on the reauthorization of previous bonds, I was always under the assumption that they were project specific. And what it sounded like is that we are reauthorizing previous bonds for old projects and using them for new projects. Did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I must not have made that clear. No, we only can reauthorize if the project is not complete. And so we just reauthorize to have the bonds be in place until that project is complete. They are project specific.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify for the group.
Along those lines, excuse me, Todd Arterburn here. At what point in the development of a capital project do the funds need to be authorized by the council for that project to continue in development? So, for example, the East Columbia Library, which we saw an estimate of, as I recall, $20 million. Does that have to be funded now in full before it proceeds anymore, or does it continue to proceed, move along through the design and development process pending authorization of the bond funds that have to be authorized?
So for that project, there have already been some PAYGO funds authorized to begin the design process. So we would authorize funds for the design and the preliminary, and then when it's to the point where they're ready to do construction, then we would need to authorize at that point the bonds for construction. So that's the only time when we really, if we're doing the design separate from the building. Recently, we've been doing a lot more design builds with one contractor on our projects.
So does it just continue along with everybody knowing that the estimate is $20 million until such time as the bond authorization is made? Or is the decision already made that we're going to do it? It's just now a timing issue on when the $20 million authorization is made?
I think before it's authorized by the council through the budget, what's in out years, they are still subject for discussion and decision. So it is all open for discussion and the changes there, because in capital budget, even it's a long-term planning, in the out years were shown there, every year's amount is through the annual budget process. So every year the council approves only that year's CIP total amount. Future years is for planning purpose, but they are subject to changes.
Thank you.
This is Steve again. Just some clarifying questions on the transfer tax issuance that's on the chart there. So for fiscal year 21, the authorization was 19 million, and I'm assuming that was based off of an estimate of what we believe the increase in transfer tax would bring, and then it looks like that we've issued and it's going down to $10 million. So we issued maybe 9 million or in fiscal year 2021. So therefore the authorization that will remain is 10 million for fiscal year 2022. So that's the one piece. And then if transfer taxes don't remain at the same level to support the $20 million in debt because of the variability of them, then general fund revenues would have to be used for payment of those bonds, correct?
Correct. So the second part of the question, Steve, thank you for the clarification. That's very true. So a lot of self-sustainable bonds that has been using dedicated resources there, in general, they still have full face and credit. So in other words, we're counting on anticipated resources from those resources, such as transfer tax, to pay specific debt. But if they don't get into, they don't perform as originally projected, then it will be added to the net burden to the general fund. So that's a good clarification question. In terms of the design of the transfer tax there, we actually have conscientiously want to minimize such risk. So as a result, with very rare exception, last year's exception because of one-time needs for to keep some critical school project moving, and the state funding was not anticipated funding was not realized, at least when the budget was adopted there. So the county kind of step up with that one-time bump using bonds supported by T-tax. But other than that, all future years, that's why it come down. All future years there only assume cash payments. So how much transfer tax coming, we will use how much, and also leave some in the balance to maintain the debt service on that there. That will give us more flexibility to avoid that will be a good balance, because if we issue too much bonds, then it's getting very difficult to adjust to that. If we have most of the future years, or in general only use cash pay-go, and then we spend how much we get. If we don't have that, then we will lower the spending accordingly, at least in the following year, to make a quick adjustment to deal with the reality. And one of the issues we talked with committee in the last couple of years is historically there are a lot of practice, really not sound financial practice, are using those dedicated resources to issue bond, but did a front upload big amount authorized. So they're counting on all future years of revenue from that resources are paying for that one or two single bond, which means all future years the resources from that tax is not available for any additional needs in the out years. Not only that, but also if there's any risk revenue is not as high as original anticipated there, then we will be in trouble and could potentially add burden to general fund. So in the past couple of years, we have been changing practice. Now going forward, generally all the designated sources here, we use it for the cash pay-go rather than try to incur new bond, because we want to avoid getting into that situation again, given the risks.
I mean, that's great. Most of the other direct sources are fee based. Maybe it's just as variable and unpredictable as the transfer tax. These just feel like go bonds under a different name, and we really issued 90-something million in go bonds and just called 20 of it school transfer tax. I mean, I guess it's the transfer tax is the way that the legislation was approved. It's similarly protected like the ag tax, so we couldn't use it for something else. We couldn't. It's geared towards the schools, and it can't be used for something else anyway. So it could build positive growth. It's just I'm sorry, and it doesn't. It's just that the reason we were talking about it for the last few years is we have a real debt problem in this county where we're very comfortable taking on additional debt to build things that we want to have. And we say it's because we need to have them, and we can make the arguments that we need to have them, but it is also that we want to have them, and this is just a continuance of that addiction to debt that we have, and it shows in the charts here, and it's why we had to do the P3 project for the courthouse, because we couldn't afford to do it a different way, because we are building other things that are taking up the debt, and so we all, it's like a penalty at the end of a football game. That's the reason we lost the game, and it's not. It's everybody looks at that as, oh my goodness, we're breaking all of these metrics that we want to stick to because of the courthouse, and the courthouse was a problem from the federal government that we've been kicking the can down the road for so many years that we had to do this, but it becomes like the beacon of a failure, but really it's all the other decisions that have led to it. And I know I'm just saying it for the purpose of saying it, but it's just frustrating that we continue to issue this much debt, but we don't need to talk about it anymore. I apologize.
Right. Thank you, Steve. But these are very to the point, because these are all critical questions. As what you just said is really the big challenge today for capital, because the needs are there way above affordable level, but on the debt side, we are stressed so much. All those indicators, essentially Nikki showed earlier, are trending up, and some actually are already to a level that's more than what's original targeted there. So these are reality. We just have to balance that and keep an eye on that. Actually, thank you for all the questions. My next presentation, I'll start by talking about capital, so we'll continue some of this discussion. Thank you very much, Nikki. So the host, could you allow me to share file for a presentation? Thank you. Let me get this one, I think. All right, I'll make it full screen. I think that'll be better. All right. Okay, can you see that? I assume it's okay. All right, so we'll continue the dialogue. Thank you. So I'll start by talk about the county's CIP outlook, and then transfer to operating budget discussion. So we just talked about the GEO bonds. So here's a history about how much is available typically in annual approved CIP budget. So until a few years ago, it's usually more than $90 million there. But given all the factors we talked about, that the debt indicators are trending up, all of them, as well as the county's revenue growth has been slowing down in recent years. There, both the county and the committee has been looking at lower those GEO obligations authorized each year. So in FY21, the amount come down to $75 million. So that's generally what's available. The ask, however, is much more than that. We have been working with different stakeholders. I think the requests have been improving compared to a few years ago, but it's still way above what's available. So currently, collectively, the request from county agency and education entities in this period of time, next to 6 years, the average is $131 million. So depending on how much will be the new debt authorization, at this point, we're assuming anywhere between 70 to 90 million a year based on historical level. The gap will be between 42 to 62 million every year on average, which is huge. It is essentially between 1/3 to half of total requests. Essentially has to either find new sources, which is not very likely, or you have to find a way to reduce them. So here's a more closer look at the request by year. In fiscal year 22, the total bond asked at this point is $117.5 million. If we base on the scenario between $75 million or $90 million available as an early guess, the gap will be between 27.5 to 47.5 below in the table. And going forward there, that trend continue. And on average, as we talk about, the annual gap is between 42 to 62 million. And in the 6-year time frame, the gap is between 151 to 371 million dollars that we cannot afford to fund from those requests there. So here's a breakdown a little bit further on at least some of the key projects. We're not able to list everything here. So on the very top is our obvious, always our key priority, our school system, community college and library. It combined FY22. Here's the ask of 70.2 million out of the county geo bond. By the way, this table doesn't include either bond or cash payable from other sources, designated sources there. So these are only talk about one that directly impact general fund with net impact. So school will be 70.2. Alex City Safe and Sound, we know that's a long-term big project, that's 6.7. Then there's a long list of all kinds of priority projects. Alex City 50+ center, detention center, systemic renovation, IT, fleet, recreation parks, road construction, sidewalk, etc. So everything together is 117.5 million, and going forward, that trend to continue. A couple things to highlight is that if you just look at education and Alex City, those two combined in the next 6 years total is about 417 million total. If we assume bond authorization is 80 million a year, then in the next 6 years is 480. So that's almost 100% of resources there. It's just to cover those two combined. If we go with those first, then you have essentially nothing for everything else across the county for any of this, either high priority projects or maintenance from the for existing properties, infrastructure, etc. There's one thing to note is that this request does include a Wi-Fi loan, as Nikki mentioned earlier. That is a very favorable loan from federal government with a longer term, 30-year term, and lower interest rate. We put it here because it doesn't have really designated resources. It used general fund to pay that service here. So we include it in the total calculation. One thing to clarify is that the prior table is not entire CIP requests. That's the one excluding those other project components that's already assumed certain level of designated resources. We talked about transfer tax earlier. We also counted on school surcharge, state aid, etc. Just using school as an example, FY22 total school CIP request is 108 million. That include a 40.2 million projected state aid. In terms of county funding, there's 51.9 million geo bonds reflect in the prior table, but there's also 16 million designated county funding from T-tax and school surcharge. One thing is that those assumptions for other sources, no matter state aid or transfer tax, etc., if that's not materialized, then whatever the gap will likely be added to the geo in prior table as additional needs there. So what we can tell is that we have very significant issues related to capital. It really bothers me because I really don't see a valid solution unless without pain, to put it that way. It's going to be painful one way or another because its gap's so big, and it's not only 1 year, it's in the next 6 years. So it is going to be a struggle how to live within means. What this means that it's more likely there will have to be collected efforts to prioritize and have to probably eliminate or reduce or delay many projects to not only by a year or two, but beyond a 6-year window, because you can tell that everything add up. It's a way above what we can afford without breaking our debt affordability there. There are also probably continued efforts needed to seek for new resources, probably more likely in terms of asking for state and federal investment infrastructure. I think the country has not been keeping up to speed in terms of investing enough, especially from federal government on infrastructure. On the county level, recent years, there were already legislation passed raising surcharge, transfer tax. Those actually were already designated to CIP to provide additional capacity. Given current economic climate, it's probably very unlikely there will be new resources available. The other issues I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, and the committee has been pointed out in its last year's report, is how to balance the needs between maintaining existing infrastructure, which has been aging and has rising needs now, no matter it's roads, storm drainage, all those other things there, versus a new project. There are a lot of new projects there currently in the pipeline or in the process of construction, and how to balance the two is going to be a key challenge given the pretty clear fiscal constraints there. There are also some complication on top of that is about the cost dilemma of delaying projects. If there are certain projects we know we have to do in next several years, then sometimes delaying is not necessarily be the most beneficial, because the interest rate these days are roughly low, might remain low for the next couple of years, but beyond that, who knows, right? So the same debt, if you issued later, it could be more costly. The other thing is construction cost has been escalating very fast. So as a result, 1 or 2 year of delay, we might, from what we heard from program managers, there double-digit increase of total project cost. So all these are the things like we kind of have to deal with. So now I can move on to operating budget. Fiscal outlook on the revenue side, as you all know, on general fund, the majority of the revenues in the county are concentrated on property tax and income tax. They combined represent about 90% of general fund revenues. So we'll focus on those two. Only talk a little bit about other sources there. So property assessable base based on the State Department of Assessment Taxation projections, which was posted about a month ago, represent about 2.3% total growth from last year's budget. In terms of reassessment, 1/3 of the county's real property get reassessed each year. The percentage growth for the most recent area, once you do a phasing, is about 3.1% a year. So largely comparable with other areas in recent years there. If you look at the graph down, that's the assessable base change year after year. Now, the first decade is very good, and after a recession, it has been coming back, but remain a relative moderate growth. In recent years, is actually trend down slightly. So for now, it's anywhere between 2 to 3% reasonably. One thing to continue on the discussion, I think some of the committee members mentioned earlier, including I think this morning. I'm sorry, my mind is a little bit blank. One of the speakers mentioned about the commercial-based development. The county's commercial base have been and continue to outpace residential development. These numbers shown are triennial total before 3-year phasing. So on annual basis, this number needs divided by 3. But in general, the county's commercial base had been not only more than the residential base growth, but also outperformed the state average. So that's really a positive thing. And it has been adding value to the county's overall revenue growth there. And that's part of the reason why we think on the policy side, it's important to support those commercial base increase. Now, looking forward, there are different factors impacting property tax future performance. On the positive side, we know that, or heard from the news, there are very strong housing market currently in both the county and in the nation, and partly due to very low mortgage rates in the county, and that's also partly because of very low inventory. So the price keep going up. So in the calendar year 2022, both the house prices and also the transaction number actually goes up, even in the pandemic time, with exception only a couple of months. On the negative side, there are things of concern is the commercial-based potential weakening from what we read from different places there. It looks like retail, hotel, and office building there, we might see less demand in the next few or even longer period of time, depending on how people adjust to their work pattern, may get stressed to some extent. The personal property taxes, which means the business property tax, that also likely to see some impact. And the other thing is, in such an economic environment, when people lose jobs, they may or may not be able to afford mortgage anymore. So we'll likely see some foreclosure with a lagged impact. At this point, there are different programs to provide help with both federal funding and local funding. But down the road, it is a possible scenario as a risk there. The issue is a lot of this will not likely get reflected immediately, both in the positive and negative side there, because the triennial cycle. So some of the impact on property tax will not be felt until multiple years down the road. So the uncertainty comes from not only the timing because of the lagging impact, but also there are some also medium and long-term issue. One is the moratorium impact of AFFORDABILity amendment, which is going to stop a large portion of the new development based on previous projection, based on potential school test failure or the capacity criteria, and that has a lot of impact on not only property tax base, but also income tax on other bases there. There will also continue to be the land constraint issue that will impact long-term assessable base growth. Income tax is a really, really big, strange situation so far. I think all the economists and also forecasters at state and local level were completely surprised about what has been happening, because what we have been seeing really different from everybody's early prediction is when employment went down, the personal income data actually went up. It's really counterintuitive. So the graph to the right are from Maryland State Bureau of Revenue Estimate, and what's on the top is a forecast and history of employment. And what's done is the personal income. You can tell that what's on the top graph is very probably as we expected, meet our expectation. And during the pandemic months, it has a very sharp decrease of employment there because of pandemic and the social distancing and closing down. So that's a very sharp decrease. And following that we have been seeing a ticking back, not all the way back yet, but there's some improvement. And at this point, the state is actually their consultants are jointly anticipate it's going to come back. And this time frame is really from the bottom to it all the way go back to pre-pandemic level. They're projecting 2 to 3 years to come back to pre-pandemic level. So that's essentially what was predicted by the state and state consultants there. Now what's coming down is the personal income. Originally, everybody thought, including the state, they will largely mirror the one on the top, and maybe with a slight lag because sometimes take a while to reflect in the payroll and tax there. But what we have been seeing is the opposite. During the time in the pandemic months, what the state has been experiencing is a bump of personal income above, not only is not a decrease, but also is above the normal trend of personal income, which really puzzles everyone. However, they are predicting that was a temporary phenomena. After that, it's going to calm down. And at some point, after some time, it will go back to normal trend. It's very, very strange situation. And that same curve or roller coaster has been reflecting the county level income tax as well. This is the 3-year average in the last 3 years before the pandemic year. We averaged 2.2% of income tax in actual income tax receipts. During fiscal year 20, that's 12.8%. That's basically like 6 years total growth there in 1 year. That year is abnormal, as we talked earlier, partly because a large chunk of reconciliation from some lagged impact of federal tax law change a couple years ago. So it's mostly one time. But we also found out is during the pandemic months, during with the limited information we got, these months tax continue to see a pretty strong growth, about 4 to 5% from a year ago. That's above the 3-year average. And we're not alone. We heard that from everybody. I was at a meeting with DC government last week in their revenue forecaster group there. Pre-pandemic income tax was about 3.3% growth. During the pandemic months, it was doubling to 6 to 8%. So what happened? The biggest or main explanation we have been got from everyone, and we think it is true, is the federal stimulus, especially the unemployment insurance. From what we heard is that a large portion of unemployed people, at least on temporary basis, actually received more than when they actually had the job. And partly of that is because it's related to the fact that this pandemic has been hitting certain sectors most, and which happen to have a lower wage jobs there. So those unemployment insurance provide huge help, at least on temporary basis, that provide a big bump in that period of time, although it's really a temporary phenomenon. The other part is that because these jobs are relatively lower paid, we actually have a bar, by the way, a graph to the right, and these are from EDA, so that's a county data. You can tell that what's on the top, the blue, the red bars represent the unemployment insurance percentage. So the accommodation, foods, entertainment, hotels, these are the ones hit the hardest. But in terms of average income, which is represented by the green bar, they are actually the ones with relatively lowest income in this period of time. So that explains that why, while there's approximately about 17% of the county's jobs are impacted, their impact on income taxes is much smaller, because as a group, they represent a much smaller proportion. The other thing is Maryland has a progressive income tax structure. So as a result, even this group were hit pretty hard. The impact on income tax is not necessarily that big. But the second and third bullets are only going to explain why it's not a double-digit dip, why not is a huge dip. It cannot explain why it's a bump, right? So the federal stimulus are the one, I think it's the main reason why we see a normal increase. So what does that mean for fiscal 2022? So I actually recently got quite some calls from colleagues from other offices, other budget offices in the county, because I've been doing this for a long time in terms of forecasting. But I really don't know myself. This is a year of such a big uncertainty. I wouldn't be able to say I know very clearly what's happening, but I'll share with you what I think is happening or likely happening. So I know that, or I think, between fiscal 20 and 22, we're going to continue to see very strange income tax curves there, because it's clearly there's a clear delinkage between these and economic fundamentals there. So what's happening is that when the economy finally come up, the income tax actually may go the opposite, because the original bump is not real. It doesn't really reflect the true job and the wage status. So some of the pumped up hope on that, if it start to go away, then the real job actually may not even meet the bump time. So as a result, it actually may see the opposite trend in the next couple of years. There's also lagged impact concern, because the natural way of tax filing and refund reconciliation there, historically it takes at least a couple of years there to see the full result. So some of this will be extended to 22 and even fiscal 23 potentially, for what's happening in this calendar year and the continuation of the pandemic, their impact on the economy. So we did mention that the state consultant and also the local economists are anticipating employment and recovery will take at least a couple of years. But how much will be the refund for the UI? It's very uncertain. We already know that originally from the state that a large part of the unemployment insurance eventually will be paid back through the refunding and reconciliation process. But also most recently, the governor made an announcement of exempting these unemployment insurance from withholding of state and local taxes. That means there will be downward adjustment down the road between the end of fiscal 21 and fiscal 22 for calendar year 2020 unemployment insurance. The dollar amount is not very clear. The timing is not super clear either, but there will be some downward adjustment from that. And economic recovery, as some of those economists mentioned earlier in previous presentation, are contingent on multiple factors: vaccine, federal stimulus, any other policy changes. So there's still a lot of unknowns down the way. So currently at the county level, unemployment rate have been showing improvement since the peak during the spring and summertime. It's still above, obviously, and quite above the pre-pandemic level. In terms of the personal income growth, here's Dr. Clinch's presentation, which he showed to the group earlier, and I just turned it into graph, the potential performance of the personal income in the county. As you can tell, that 2020 estimated to be a spike from what we have been experiencing in the past 2 years. And then it's likely follow a slowdown dramatically in calendar 2021, and it will probably take a couple more years to go back to normal level growth. So in terms of overall revenue projections, our preliminary projection based on what we know and what we think at this point, based on existing data, so we're looking at 26.7 million growth from fiscal year 21 level. That's about 2.3%. It's a moderate growth. It's actually better than the current fiscal year, but lower than last year's projected level before the pandemic, right? So the projected revenue growth coming from the following major categories. Property tax, we are looking at about 2%. That's pretty much based on SDAT's forecast. Income tax, we are looking at 6.6% budget to budget, because as we just talked about, we only have 1 quarter of data from the current fiscal year, but that quarter was way above what we were originally anticipated. We were originally thinking fiscal year 21, when we budgeted income tax, we keep at slightly above fiscal year 19 actual level, essentially pre-pandemic level, but the current, the first quarter continued to show very strong growth. We do know that they will get mitigated at some point, but we also know the federal stimulus continue to come in. So at this point, we're looking at budget to budget growth of 6.6% in fiscal year 22. Other local taxes here combined together are anticipated to show a recovery. It's really a mixed story here. There are some local taxes are actually coming even lower than original budget FY21. I'm talking about hotel and motel tax and also admission tax. Hotel tax has been coming down 60% each month during the pandemic compared to historical level. We originally budget some decrease, but nothing close to that. Admission tax also dropped by 80% year to date. Fortunately, these are not the biggest tax we have, because we have property and income tax, and the recordation tax. The first quarter also see a double-digit decrease, but the last couple of months have been seeing some recovery. So as a result, year-to-date recordation tax is down compared to a year ago, but better than budgeted, it looks like, if that trend continue. So as a result, local tax, we see a mixed bag, but we are seeing next year should come back to some level. I don't think hotel and admission will be on 100 back, but at least should see some improvement, assume the vaccine plays its role. State share tax, that's just minor adjustment based on year-to-date. Charge for service and the permits, it's a little bit increase. What happens is we're assuming most permits and service also see some recovery, but that's offset by a loss of $2 million from housing federal prisoners. So that actually was dropping, that offset some of the recovery projections. other things, pretty moderate change. Other financing and transfers, there are a couple of components there accounting for the change. Part of that is a one-time technical change because last year, County Council made a decision to temporarily shift some of the funding from the Housing Renew Fund to General Fund as a placeholder. So they can hold on that until later decide on certain housing project, and then later they can move it back to those. So that's a temporary transfer that's no longer there in FY22. And also we included a one-time use of $4 million transfer from other funds to help bridge the gap in general fund that year, which is also not assumed going forward. The council also approved 7.5 million use of reserve to help bridge the gap to mitigate impact on the service there given the pandemic. That actually is not based on the charter. The charter actually requires reserve only be used on one-time, non-recurring type of expenditure, except in emergency situation, which requiring 4 or more council votes. That's what happened. So that one-time action is not expected to be repeated. And once you remove that 7.5 million, the total revenue growth budget to budget is 26.7 million or 2.3%. So in fiscal 22, there are certain challenges here. It's really related to prior year budget final decisions there. We just talk about part of the one-time solutions on the revenue side, no matter it's use of reserve or use temporary transfer from other funds to cover ongoing recurring expenditure. These are the people in the payroll, etc. So the expenditure is not going to go away, but that revenue is going to be gone in FY22. That's going to create a hole when we go towards fiscal 22. There are also multiple reductions. There are short-term, non-sustainable. It helped FY21 at that point, but it's not sustainable. Like, just cut the snow removal cost, cut the contribution to risk management, freezing pretty much all civilian vacancies across the county. Those does help temporarily, but it's not sustainable. At least we need to restore part of that funding in FY22, if not 100%. So these one-time measures is adding some additional, pretty significant additional challenge in 22 above the normal challenges there. So where we are now, FY22 for operating budget, we have a gap of 36 million on operating budget between what was requested from all entities and what is projected in terms of revenue growth. So the gap is 36 million based on the revenue 26.7 million projected and the request currently. So again, education entities, they're our top priority. If just their requests combined together, that's already essentially equivalent to all revenue growth. On the expenditure side there, we also know there are certain costs are obligated and non-discretionary. Debt service payment, this is the increase is a projection currently, but as soon as the bond is issued, it's going to be full obligation. We have to pay the debt increase there. This is non-debatable. P3 annual service payment, the courthouse will be completed shortly, and the contract will kick in, and that will be a new annual cost that started in fiscal year 22. One clarification, the school number, because this is 22.1 million, was not mentioned, I think, in the school superintendent's presentation the other day. So this is just to provide some clarification. These are the number actually from the superintendent's budget that was posted online, and we also got confirmation. So what happens is the school was anticipating, the school was or superintendents was requesting total budget growth of 13.8 million, which is 1.5%, a very moderate growth. However, at this point, the school is assuming flat state aid and also some adjusting other resources. So the requested county funding growth, at least temporarily in this proposal, represented 22.1 million increase of county funding, which is 3.6%. And there's always a question about maintenance efforts. So just to refresh people's memory on that, the formula-driven effort growth for county funding, which is a mandate based on the school enrollment data, as the superintendent mentioned the other day, is represent a drop of 2.8%, which transferred to 17.5 million growth. So if really based on formula-driven MOE, the county's funding will drop by 17.5 million based on MOE. Obvious, that's a minimum. That's not necessarily what the county should do, but that's just the full clarification of putting into the context. The issues related to operating budget today is for me and for my colleagues there is that there are no low-hanging fruits anymore. The county has been experiencing revenue constraints, slowdown of budget for at least the past several years. So we really have been working together with everyone to find savings. So at this point, they are really not places you can just look over and find meaningful savings with quick efforts there. And also the county agency are in hiring freeze now. So many departments are already struggling to cope with service needs, which typically rise in the pandemic. So it's kind of difficult to find more savings from staff because they're already in hiring freeze, generating as much as possible from the vacancy savings there. We also know revenue options is not very feasible in current economic climate. We have to be mindful to the potential additional burden to our citizens and residents and business there. So as a result, any further reductions will really likely risk some direct impact on staff and services there. We also know, and it's proved, that one-time short-term solution can help temporarily, but it is going to have very significant side impact or creating structural deficit in future years, which we have been just talked about. I also want to provide a quick clarification on fiscal 20 surplus. As mentioned, I think in prior presentation, the county was doing really well in fiscal 20 with surprisingly high revenues, primarily because there's just one-time reconciliation for federal tax law change a few years ago. So there are some questions about the surplus on that from the public. So a couple of things to clarify that is the surplus is not only generated by one-time event, but also it can only be used on one-time non-recurring expenses per county charter. Not only that, so it cannot be used for, typically, it shouldn't be used to do payroll, etc., because it's a one-time, it doesn't always exist there. And we also need to replenish and grow the policy reserve, which was depleted in developing FY21 budget. That's a $7.5 million there to help FY21. So we need to replenish and grow that to maintain AAA rating and enhance our capacity in a time of unknowns. So we actually need to boost rather than reduce that reserve. We also already utilized 6.5 million out of surplus, which is just approved by the county council for pandemic assistance program, and we will likely need more. I don't know what time. It could be later this fiscal year, it could be next fiscal year, or it could be beyond next fiscal year, because we are anticipating continued needs for those impacted residents or organizations and business there. Also, there are potential needs to use some of surplus to bridge part of the very significant CIP project gaps, at least to keep potentially keep some high priority projects moving, given the fact that otherwise we probably have to make very, very significant cuts to the CIP requests. So come to multi-year projections, the graph looks very similar to last year. So we continue to see, based on the project expenditure from all the agencies, continue to see the expenditure growing at a faster pace at revenues in the next several years. On average, revenue growth was seen as about 2.5%. Expenditure is actually higher than that. So that's going to create a gap the range from 36 million annually to more than 100 million if there's no action being taken. In reality, obviously, every year we have to balance the budget. We'll find a way to make it work, but that means that what's projected expenditure will get reduced or cut every year in order to make that happen. I have to say that expenditure growth here, based on everybody's preliminary projection, including education entities here, it's really not that outrageous. If you look at the bottom line, in fiscal 23 to 27, most years it's kind of between 3.5, 3.9%, which is, it actually looks very reasonable. The only issue is revenue growth is lower than that. At this point, we're projecting at 2.5%. So even a reasonable level expenditure, it may not be able to be affordable based on the revenue, based on these projections there. So the next slide just show a little bit more breakdown of the projections. Property tax, income tax was projected to maintain 2 to 3% growth in the next 6 years on average. There will be some uncertainty when it comes to individual years, but as a trend, that's probably still a likely trend. And some of the other ones, they're either see minor growth or kind of flat for now. That's just a general projection. In terms of long-term trend, there are different factors could impact that. We already talked about economic recovery pace, a lot of uncertainties there, state federal actions there that will play a role. The lagging impact is going to change some of the, it's going to impact at least a few years down the road. And we also have to keep in mind the AFFO amendment impact and moratorium of new development, or at least a part of the new development, as well as demographic trend and land development trend. The last three actually will be captured by our speakers today from planning and zoning and their consultant. So, so that's just a kind of segue to the next presentation. So I'll stop there, maybe open up for 5 minutes for questions, and I'll hand over to planning and zoning. Thank you. So any questions?
Holly, I have a quick question. This is Todd.
Sure.
If we overlay projected population growth on top of that projected income growth or revenue growth, what's our real change in revenue growth per person?
That's a good question. I think the last decade or so, the county's overall population is about 1.5%. Jeff, are you available? Could you chime in on the population growth?
Yes, I'm here. I think that's right. I think on average we've been experiencing about a 1.5% population growth, maybe 1%. Okay. Yeah.
So if we're looking at a 1.5% population growth and a 2.3% revenue growth and a 1% inflation rate, aren't we really going backwards?
Yeah. The math sounds right.
So no wonder we have challenges.
Well, this is Steve. Todd, and maybe we can clarify this a little bit, Holly. Your revenue projections include a use of fund balance here. Fund balance is created from surplus in prior years, correct?
Correct.
Which would lead me to believe that we're estimating 2.3%, but we're actually growing at a higher rate, that we are able to create a surplus to grow. So
correct.
Maybe we're not going backwards, Todd, but based on those fund balances, we're at least staying flat.
Right. For fiscal 22, yes.
Well, no, exactly. Well, you've projected out a fund balance for every year, which is kind of weird in the projection, because you would think that the projection would cover all of the
usually,
and then it would tie probably more into what Todd's saying, but it kind of ties into the thought that the development and the growth that we're doing is not adding to revenue at the same rate as we would want it to, or is adding to revenue but adding to expenses at a greater rate.
Right.
And if you look at the type of development we're doing right now and growth, that kind of makes sense, right? Higher density.
I think you're right, Steve. That's really the core question is not just the raw numbers, but what's our revenue per resident, and how will that change over time as the characteristic of new development change the nature of the housing stock.
Mm-hmm.
And high income residents, but if they go into, denser housing that doesn't have the same per capita tax rate that larger housing has, then maybe you're getting a higher percentage of the income tax piece from the new residents, but you're getting a lower percentage of the growth in property taxes and other types of taxes.
Right, and as we move more and more toward a higher percentage of retired population in the county, obviously their incomes go down significantly.
Yeah, I think a lot of this trend is really very much related to that in terms of demographic changes here. You just mentioned, I think, thought about the aging population. That's both implication on the revenues to the county and also the service needed there. The development pattern and the house profile, that's also going to have an impact in terms of the different type of housing, the revenue versus expenditure or needs from the county. So they all are connected. Actually, our next speaker will talk about some of that. So I don't know whether there's any more questions, or I should just move to Jeff to talk about the demographic and land development.
This is Richard. I had one quick question about the capital plan that you showed very early. That did not assume anything in the next 6 years for the corrections, correct? For fixing it. It was, because we've heard for every year.
Yeah, detention center, what happens is that this building really needs a replacement because it's so old, it has so much issues there. And there's also some kind of issues you really couldn't just let go. So, but it's expensive. I mean, the early projections anywhere between 60 to 80 million. We just don't have money. So we work together with corrections and our facilities here. We're able to find a way to do some investment already, which already started a few years ago and continue next 2 years to finish some most urgent repair or renovation, just keep things moving to buy us time. So that has been built in the projections and also the actual work in the last couple of years, the security system, some of the medical units, those kind of thing there. So that actually it was already factored in. But eventually, so that's why it looks not that big in this next 6 years, but eventually, I don't know when, maybe several years down the road, that will be a building would really need a much bigger investment, but it is okay. The current investment, if this gets funded, at least can buy the more time on a short period of time, at least in the next several years.
I was just trying to say that so it's safe to assume that this gap between what's needed and what's available in terms of capital funding is even greater because
it's actually much bigger. I cannot speak to other entities here, but for the county ones, this is after we talk with them already brought down huge from the original what they think is minimum. So this is already FY22, for example, the list showing there, that's already, I think, 30 million or something lower from what they originally program managers think will be needed. We say we just cannot afford it, do our best. So this is already after that first round of exercise. And we know there's some of these will be needed, but there's no way to fund it. That's already put back to the future years already. So this is not even what people wanted. This is, at least for the county project, this is what people do think it's a minimum, but obviously they add up to the whole overall request that's much higher than what's needed. I just give you one example. For example, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it goes back to what I said earlier about the courthouse, right? We're talking about something and saying, oh, it's expensive. It's no more expensive than a school. And how many schools are we going to build in the interim when we have this other pressing need that's out there? So we're making choices to do other things, and then the detention center becomes this, oh, it's really expensive to do. Yeah, it's expensive to do, but it's less than a high school, and it's, probably on par with an elementary school from a new build cost. So we're making choices to build schools, and from what I saw a few weeks ago, we're in decreasing enrollment, and we're putting off the detention center, which we've seen presentations in previous years of the significance of the issues that we're trying to patch. And basically the $10 million we're going to spend over the next 5 years that is outlined here is money we are throwing away, because we know that that's going to have to be rebuilt at some time, and we're just using a little bit at a time, 5 million, 6 million over the next 2 years, to buy us time to build more schools and other things instead of what we have to do, which is build a new detention center.
Well, I would actually say it's worse than throwing it away, because we're going to be paying debt service on that $10 million long after the building doesn't exist.
So we're going to throw away the building when we tear it down, and we're going to be paying for it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like
exactly.
Going to college and not getting a degree and having to pay the student loans.
The reality that the spending on that detention center, that call it that $10 million, is it's not really a capital expense, it's a maintenance expense that we've ignored so long that now we feel like we need to bond it to pay for it instead of just paying for it out of current revenues.
Yeah, I think both of you actually had touched on some critical piece related to capital budgets. One is that the how to prioritize, because there are so many needs, and also not only that, the prior decision will drive today's needs as well, because some of the maintenance needs, no matter in us or other entities here, has been having been going up, a lot of backlog there. That is actually also come. The second question is how to address the existing property or infrastructure needs there, no matter renovate, maintain properly, or there's a lot of backlog there, and also very fundamental infrastructure, roads, sidewalks, storm drainage, those things, versus a new project. There are a lot of them. There are a lot of needs, and the community demands for those as well. But how do you balance all this with very limited resources to address any of this appropriately?
Holly, are we going to get a presentation about the detention center needs this year, or no?
We're not. We're running out of time this year to do. We did other things there, but not. I think, if you recall, actually, there was a presentation by Mark Stromdale when he was here to talk about facility project. Detention center was included in his presentation.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Right. We didn't do a separate one for that. So correction, representative was not there, but he did cover that in his presentation.
So,
okay.
Holly,
Yeah,
I have a question.
I'm sorry. I was just listening to the conversation, and it's a really kind of tricky problem, and to the extent that what we're talking about here, the reason why I thought a presentation would be helpful is to the extent we're talking about safety needs and upgrades to the facility, which is what we heard, I think, from the detention center folks last year. I mean, that all makes sense, but to the extent there are policy decisions that are driving the need, I think it'd be helpful to sort those out, so we know sort of what's the purview of the spending committee here, and what are questions that the county council or even the state legislature should be thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Holly?
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
To dovetail on that point about the policy decisions, could you bring us up to date on how much income we've lost on the immigration piece, or have we, or will we? Because that's huge for our detention center too.
Are you talking about the housing of federal prisoners? That's just 2 million. We lost 2 million.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
yeah.
I mean, that has to factor in too. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
That's what I'm getting at, Barbara. It's really bed space is what it comes down to is, you know, are we making adjustments to bed space here, which are policy decisions and not our purview, but I think should be noted.
Exactly. That's why I wanted to bring this up. And I have to say, since we expanded our time for these meetings, I was disappointed not to see the detention center on our agenda. So if there were a way to squeeze something in from Jack Kavanaugh, that might be helpful. I don't know.
Thank you, Barbara.
Holly, I have a question and I have one comment.
Yeah, sure. So,
Okay.
so Dr. Wu, after your comments there, then we will move to next speaker because I know DPZ still have important long-term issues to talk to. Go
Sure,
ahead.
thank you. Okay, so I think my comment, the school system is facing the similar issues, right? We have a lot of old buildings. We need to build new, but we don't have funding. So we have to do renovations years after year. It's a similar situation we're facing now. And my question I look at the Alex City Safe and Sound plan. We're spending $80 million next year. What's the status for that one right now?
Alex City, well, first of all, in terms of funding, I think of the 80 million, at this point, it was temporarily assumed 75 million. We could do up to 80.5 million from federal WIFI loan, which will be 30-year loan and with a more favorable interest rate compared to county G1. But that's in terms of the project status, it's still in early stage because the big part in terms of tunnel, etc., that has not been started there. So so it's still in early stage, but the DPW team are in the process looking at the engineering options there about what to do. So I think when executive develops his proposed budget, there will be a final plan. And then the plan is going to get executed actually a little faster than originally thought, because originally I think it was extended to beyond a 6-year period of time. But in order to qualify WIFI loan, it actually has to be essentially spent within the next 6 years or something like that to get qualified for that. So that will be some adjustment for the schedule from early plan. But that's all I know at this point because it's still in discussion. It's a pretty complex project, as you know. So in terms of the funding, in terms of the schedule, in terms of different approach on engineering, that's still in the process.
I see. Thank you. Because
Thank
you
you for the
said,
question.
I agree with you, because each county exactly may have different perspective. The project, the scope may change over time. I just don't know how you will like flash out in the future.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Jeff, are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, I don't see this. Oh, there it goes. Yeah, I can share it.
Thank you. And I think if you can, maybe run the slides for you, but then also for the consultant.
Yes, I will do that. No problem. Let's see here. Okay, thank you, Holly. Good morning, everyone. The questions that were raised at the end of the conversation were a really good segue into what I'll be presenting. As Holly mentioned, I'm going to be sort of looking at the future. And so these are the topics I'll be going over. Population growth trends, including new housing and land use, and then the impact of AFFO that Holly had referred to. The last few years in the Spending Affordability Committee, we've been discussing this. So I'll provide an update on where that stands in terms of growth as we predicted it compared to what actually happened and what our current thinking is moving forward. Won't be focusing on commercial. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago briefly with EDA. During that presentation, there was an indication that commercial growth is slowing given the limited land supply. So that's the other half of the equation in terms of future growth in Howard County. And then we invited our consultant, Matt Newcastle from CEI, which stands for City Explained Incorporated. They're our general plan consultant working on HOCO by design. So he'll be giving a presentation on where we are with the HOCO by design effort and sort of the next steps moving forward. In part, it's going to be looking at presenting and evaluating various growth scenarios moving forward. So to talk about population growth, and some of this you've seen before, Holly asked me to kind of give an overall presentation on demographics, as there are some new people on the committee. This slide shows the population growth history in Howard County since 1940. The last census showed in 2010, there was about 287,000 people in the county. You see the red bars, that's an increase, projected increase. The 2020 census numbers should be out in the next few months, and we estimate it's around 330,000 people in the county. We estimate it based on starting with the base population in 2010, and then since we track housing units, we tie people to those new housing units to come up with annual estimates each year. We do look at annual population estimates that the census also does and make some adjustments based on that. So we expect that there will be about 330,000 when we get the census numbers. So it's a pretty strong rate of growth relative to past times. Growth is slowing, however, and that's what this chart shows. So this really shows the decade growth for each decade. The blue represents the absolute population growth, and then the red sort of dots represent the percent increase. So in the 70s, we almost had 100% increase in population growth of 56,000 people. That was when Columbia was going strong and the growth in the county was really, sort of taking off, continued in the decade of the 80s. And then you see since then, we've still had population growth, but it's decreased each decade. The last decade, interestingly enough, we actually had a slight increase in population compared to the previous decade. These are the latest numbers now that the decade has been completed. It's about the same rate of growth, though, 15, 16%. The future, you can see, though, is based on the current general plan. That's why you see it says Plan Howard 2030. That's the last general plan that we adopted in around, I think, 2012. So it was intended to be a 20-year time frame to 2030. We're updating the general plan now. We do that every 10 years. And so this population projection is based on the current general plan policies, current land use, current zoning, current land capacity, which there isn't much. So we estimate that for the next 10 years, based on these current trends, about 21,000 population increase. It's about a 7% growth, which is about half in percentage terms of what the great growth rate was before. And then we'll talk a little bit about, Matt will talk about, we're going to do different scenarios because that's our future based on the current general plan. And of course, we're updating that so we have an opportunity to look at the future and to think about how we want to grow or not grow into the future. A little bit on the characteristics of the population. So this is the population by race since 2010. And the county, as we all know, is becoming more diverse. And the greatest increase in population is from the Asian and Pacific Islander population. 20,000 increased, followed by African Americans at 14,000 increased, and followed by Hispanic at about 7,000. The white population has actually decreased over the last 10 years in the county. And that's really a continuing trend from the previous decade as well. This sort of summarizes that change going back, instead of the 2010, it goes back to 2000. And about 73% of the population in 2000 was non-Hispanic white. And then in 2019, it's about 50%. So when the 2020 numbers come out, Howard County will be categorized or kind of known as a majority minority county. So most of the population will consist of minorities, and that trend will likely continue into the future. A little bit on aging. This was mentioned by Holly and some of the questions, the speakers, the folks that raised questions, that the population in Howard County, like all over the country, is aging. The baby boomers are that cohort is moving through. And if you look at this for Howard County, and look at some of these numbers down here. So for example, in currently the 85 plus population is estimated to be about 4,900. It's expected to go up 562% based on the cohorts. And then you see these increases here for the older population. So that is something to consider. And that is something that we are considering in the general plan update to determine, to figure out how we can address the changing population needs and the aging of the population moving forward. It also will have economic and financial impacts, as we mentioned earlier. So in terms of new housing, this is the number of permits that were issued each year since 2001. And so for the decade from 2001 to 2010, we averaged about 1,500 units per year. In the last decade, also about a little bit higher, actually 1,600 units per year. This is primarily due to the growth management law that we have in effect, APFO, which basically manages growth to keep it sort of at a consistent level. And the previous general plan that was adopted in 2000, the policy was really carried forward with the 2010 general plan. So the APFO has been managing growth and keeping the units at this rate as we see here. You'll see these sort of spikes, and what that has to do is, and this was also mentioned, is the type of growth that we're seeing given the limited land supply, and what's left is mostly multifamily or a larger proportion of multifamily in the future. And so that's what this chart shows. So this is the growth, same chart as before, but it's by unit type. So it's comparing single family detached to townhouse units, single family attached, or apartment units, and these include both rental and condo. So you can see the single family detached has been decreasing, generally speaking, and the apartment multifamily has been increasing. And we're going to get these spikes from this point forward because you have these apartment buildings that once they get finished, they can be 300 units, 400 units. So building permits are going to get these jumps up and down moving forward. We averaged over the decade about 1,600. This is when the Great Recession occurred, so we actually had a very low number of permits relative to the past. And actually last year, in 2019, this was the lowest number of permits issued in decades, quite frankly. And this year, we had a bump up. We did experience in November and December of this year, if you talk to the Department of Inspections, Licenses, and Permits, the department that issues these permits, there was a spike because of the excise, the school surcharge tax was going up. So the county council, Paulie mentioned this, raised the school surcharge last year, I think, and so it was a phased-in approach. It had been $1.33 a square foot. In 2020, it rose to 4.75%. And then in 2021, this year, it increased to 6.25%. So there was sort of a rush to get building permits before the rate increased from $4.75 or $4.95 a square foot to $6.25 a square foot. The final phase will be in 2022, a year from now, January 2022. It'll be $7.50 a square foot. This is the same information by decade, but it basically summarizes the totals. So you can see the totals built in each decade of units, and then it's broken down by percentage. So you can see that we have this trend of less single-family detached and more apartment units and rentals and condos. And that trend is likely to continue. And that, in fact, that is what we're showing in our projections, which we'll talk about it in a minute. This is just something we do publish what's called a population and construction report. We base the population when the units are completed. So the Department of Inspections, Licenses, and Permits, they issue building permits, which was the previous information I showed. And then once the units are built, constructed, and completed, they issue a completion permit. And so you can see in 2020, there was much higher than the building permits. And sometimes that happens when you have these big projects. This, for example, was in Columbia. This 382 unit project in Columbia was, I think it's called Juniper. was the building permit was issued in 2016, but it's completed now in 2020, so it shows up here. This another large project. This is Oxford Square. So you kind of see that lag and that delay. When we do our projections for the school system, we try to incorporate that. It's becoming more challenging because you have these bigger projects. So we generally try to split these up if you think in terms of the time it takes to construct and also the lease-up rate. So it's not like you could have school pupils, for example, show up in this building all in 1 year. Talking to Howard Hughes, for example, the typical lease-up rate is between 15 apartments to 20 apartments a month. So you have a big apartment complex, it takes a few years for it to fill up. As far as moving forward and looking at our future, and we've been working with our general plan consultant on sort of the current capacity and what this current situation looks like. This is the current number of units built in the county now, and this is our current capacity, what's left. A large part of that capacity, we know when and where it's going to happen for the most part. These are units under construction as of September 30th, 2020. These are recorded lots that are unbuilt that they can now come in with a building permit to be constructed. These are subdivision plans that are in process. So DPZ is reviewing these plans. Once they're approved, the plats will get recorded and they turn into these recorded lots, and then they turn into building permits. And this is our estimate of undeveloped land capacity. It also includes some redevelopment potential. So in that number, it includes the remaining of downtown Columbia, which is close to 4,000 units. That's not in here or hasn't been built yet. So that's a large part of this undeveloped number. It also includes some redevelopment assumptions along the Route 1 corridor and the current community activity center and the transit-oriented development zones. And it also includes some development on completely undeveloped land, but there's not much of that left in the county. Only about 2% of the land is technically undeveloped with nothing on it that has development potential. So there is some redevelopment potential, for example, that we try to estimate. And that's, for example, let's say you have a house on 5 acres. That's an existing house that might have potential to be subdivided. It's very difficult to come up with exact numbers, but that's sort of estimated in these numbers. And then the total build out, given current capacity, given current policy, given current plans that we already know of, is that number there. So it's about 20,000 new homes over the next 20 years. And if you average that to over 20 years, 1,000 homes a year, and that's about a 38% reduction from the 16 homes per the last decade. So it sort of puts things in perspective of where we are today compared to the past. This is the same information, basically shows that what's left in terms of capacity, most of it is going to be 50% apartments. And we're going to end up in this situation at the, given the current build out under the current Plan Howard 2030 policy situation. Howard County actually is pretty diverse from a housing standpoint. There's only 51% are single family detached. So for a suburban county jurisdiction, we have a fair amount of apartments and townhomes, and in large part that's due to Columbia and the history of Columbia and the sort of mixed use thinking that happened back then in the 60s and the 70s. This is just shows the planning areas for Howard County. There's 5 planning areas. The next general plan, we're going to use the same concept when we think about growth. So there's Ellicott City is up, or Elk Ridge is in this area here, the northeast part of the county. Ellicott City is here. Columbia, as we all know, is right in the middle of the county, and the southeast goes from 175 through this lower southeast part of the county, and then the rural west is about 60% of the county land area, and there's a planned service area boundary line, which has been in effect and sort of thought about since the 70s, really 70s, 80s. It's gotten more solidified as general plans have moved on. There will continue to be discussion of the next general plan regarding this boundary. There's no water sewer utility service, public water sewer utility service west of this line. It's all well and septic, a lot of preserved land, and lower density growth because there's no utilities. This is So by planning area, this is the estimated growth and existing. So the blue is existing. And then the colors in the top are those categories I talked about before. So you can kind of see where the growth is going to occur. This is downtown Columbia. So you can see much of the growth will occur and is planned for it in downtown Columbia. This is the same chart, kind of cuts off the top. And so it puts things in more perspective. Of the total 19,785 capacity, this is how it's broken up by planning area. Overall land use, this is the situation currently. And, 34% is residential development, about 20% is commercial and industrial. That does include roads, utility lines. So it includes all of the sort of the arteries that get to places. And then the undeveloped land, I had mentioned it's 2%. So the 7.5% is our estimate based on sort of the re-subdivision potential as well. But it's not a lot. It's less than 8% of land left in the county. And as far as the preservation easements and parks and open space, about 40% of the county is permanently preserved. And that includes pres easements, which is ag preservation in the rural west, environmental easements in the rural west and some in the east. It includes all of the active parks that Department of Rec and Parks maintains and operates, like Blandair Park. It also includes all of the passive parks or the environmental areas that Parks and Recs maintains. And it includes state parks as well, Patapsco up in the north. And it also includes land owned by WSSC to the south, which is a buffer around the reservoir down there. This map shows that. So this is the WSSC land. Here's the reservoir. Here's the Patapsco up here. And the light green is the ag pres easements, and the darker green are the parks. This is our land use map recently updated. You can see the categories here. Pay attention to the undeveloped residential. This is this 2% and maybe some re-subdivision potential in there. You can see the light yellow. There's not a lot of it in the county. And that's why this next general plan is really going to be focused on redevelopment opportunities and where and how and if the county will grow moving forward. So really we're at sort of a shift in thinking in the county. This really started with the last general plan. It's really becoming more prominent with the current general plan. And so this is the new kind of thinking, and this next general plan is very exciting because we're going to have to start thinking about how we're going to change moving forward. So to talk a little bit of AFFO and leading growth indicators. So this was talked about with this committee a couple of years ago, as you recall. The county council passed an AFFO law. The previous county council actually passed amendments to the current AFFO law. And the effect of that was reducing the capacity utilization rates when schools were closed to new development. And it went from 115% to 105% for elementary schools. It went from 115 to 110 for middle schools. And there was never a high school test before, so it added a high school test and put the capacity utilization for that at 115. What that means is when we project future growth, if these school districts are greater than these utilization rates, then that school district is closed to development for up to 4 years. And projects are retested each year based on the new school capacity chart that is generated by the Howard County Public School System, forwarded to the county council, and then the county council adopts the chart typically each July. And that's the chart that we look at moving forward and determining whether projects can move forward or not. There's a maximum of up to 4 years only projects can be held up for school failing the schools test. And there are some other changes that were also part of that legislative package that amended AFFO as well. So the current chart went into effect last July, so July 2020, and this is the way it looks when you map it. And so the closed elementary districts are the yellow. So these are districts that are projected to be in the year 2023 closed to over 115% capacity. It's always 3 years ahead, so the way AFFO is designed. The chart looks forward 3 years because it typically takes about 3 years for projects to go through the planning process and be built and constructed. So it basically tries to put projects on hold today if that project itself will add to the crowding situation moving forward. And so the red is the elementary, and there's overlapping districts, as you can see. The blue here, the hash blue, is the closed middle school district. On the map, it's not coming out hash, but so that's closed elementary district. I'm sorry, middle school district. And then the high school district is this sort of spackled color here. And so the white areas in the county are the areas that would be currently open if a development project were to come in. So when we talked about this a few years ago, the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee recommended on one of the reports that the county hire a fiscal consultant to look at the impacts of what this will mean for the county moving forward. That happened. The fiscal consultant, Urban Analytics, came. They presented to the committee last year, and I think maybe parts of it the year before. We worked with them to come up with this growth chart that you saw before in the previous years, where this was sort of our general plan estimate, which we knew through Plan Howard 2030 that the growth was going to slow based on the limited land supply. Plan Howard 2030 went to 2030, but we sort of projected to 2040 as well, based on the policies in place for Plan Howard 2030. So, given so units will continue to decrease based on capacity. We're right here now in 2020, and the next general plan is going to look to 2040 and even beyond. So we're going to look at, how do we want to update the general plan and perhaps change policies, land use policies, et cetera. We had estimated at the time that because of the AFFO change that you'd sort of have this growth, but given AFFO was in effect in 2019, the change to AFFO making it more strict, adding the high school test, the amount of growth that would come in would be reduced, or the growth may still come in, but the projects wouldn't be able to complete for 4 years. So we sort of had this simple, okay, 4 years, they're not going to move forward. There's still some projects in the pipeline. There's some projects that are already past AFFO. There's projects like Cliff Valley that have been exempt from AFFO. So you still have some units, and then eventually it would pick up and kind of go like this. So that was what the fiscal consultant took and used, and they did their fiscal analysis, and they indicated last year that there'd be a reduction of about $63 million in net revenues. So what that is, that's sort of like, that's foregone revenue. So what they showed was that new growth does pay for itself, but because there's going to be less of it, the net revenues that new growth would create is going to be less than it would have otherwise been. So compared to the general plan scenario, there would be a reduction of $63 million in revenues we would have seen, and $152 million over 20 years. So that was presented before. Now we did an update to see where things have been. And so we first did these projections in 2018 before 2018 was done. This is what we actually achieved. So we estimated that. This was the building permits in 2019. You saw that number before, it dipped, and then in 2020, this is what it is. So it looks like the growth really is, we figured there are some things in the pipeline that would continue, but actual building permits, for whatever reason, came in less. And so that could be from the market. It's hard. It's really hard to know. It's difficult to try to predict from one year to the next, obviously. The rest of this is sort of our thinking moving forward. So it will be reduced. And this is just a guesstimate, right? We don't know. Based on what's in the pipeline and based on the fact that we have some big apartment projects that we know that are going to get building permits, those could come on board in the next few years. So you kind of see that spike. But overall, the point is that the trend and the impact from APFO is showing a reduction in units than we had anticipated. And so that will have a fiscal impact on the county moving forward. To what degree and how it affects year to year, that's difficult to determine, but you can kind of see the general trend. So I want to kind of reaffirm this or talk about this again. There is a lot in the pipeline. So if you think about the next few years, it's not like growth is going to stop. We have a fair amount in the pipeline, but it could be and the housing market is strong, which is interesting, as Holly mentioned. And plus there could be anticipation of the increasing school surcharge. So development might be coming in sooner. So it could be the next few years we have a fair level of building permits, but then at some point it will drop down. This is what's in process. And then this is the remaining downtown Columbia that is left. So we have about 11,500 units sort of in the pipeline, as we speak. We're communicating this with the general plan consultant, and so our scenarios moving forward will include these. And then the question is, what happens beyond that, and how do we want to make things be in Howard County moving forward? Just a few more slides on these are so-called leading indicators, and I presented this last year, so this is an update of this. So basically, all projects before they even come into DPZ for review are required to hold a pre-submission community meeting. So the developer goes out to the community and holds a meeting and says, this is what we're planning. And then they have up to a year to submit the plan to DPZ. So it's a good leading indicator, since every residential project has to go through this. The requirement for this started back in 2017. So if you look, an average of every 6 months, we had about 24 of these residential meetings. This was when the AFFO was amended and it became effective in July 2019. And I will wrap this up very quick. Sorry about going too long, Holly. The point is that we've had less pre-submission meetings coming in. So the number of new plans that are coming in, we're seeing evidence that they're dropping. In terms of units, it was about 743 units every 6 months, which makes sense. That's about the 1,500 per year. But now the last 18 months, we've seen pre-submission meetings that have dropped off. So that's looking forward the next 4, 5, 6 years after the pipeline is through. So it is concerning in terms of the amount of growth. We might experience a quick drop off where the one-time revenues won't be coming in, such as transfer tax and school surcharge and road excise tax. The county budget is such that structurally it's based on continued growth. So as that growth changes or slows, it will have a budgetary impact. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to introduce Matt Noonkester now, and he's going to talk a bit about the HOCO by design.
Hey, Jeff, one quick question. Todd Arterburn here. Do the low income and the moderate income apartment building or apartment units pay the same school surcharge as market rate? And is the school surcharge the same for apartments as it is for single families?
Yes, it's the same for apartments, and it's based on square foot. So when it goes up to $750 a square foot, it will be based. I'm trying to remember if for, I think in Columbia it's reduced. The moderate income in Columbia, it's less. I think for seniors it's less, but I'm not sure about. I don't remember if it's less for moderate income. I don't think it is. Holly, do you know?
Not sure.
Yeah.
And thank you, Todd. I'm sorry, like we're actually running a little bit late, so I want to make sure allow our consultant the time to finish the presentation, and after Matt finished there, then we can open up to questions here. And apologize for Matt for keep you waiting here. But also for our committee members, I know some can stay, which will be great. Please continue. If some of you cannot stay, then later at the county website, we'll post today's video so you can still replay later. Thank you, Matt. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Holly, and Jeff. Thank you for advancing the slides for me today. I appreciate it. I want to be brief. I'll probably have the least numbers in my presentation compared to everybody else because of where we're at in our process. But what I wanted to do today was build a little bit off of the January 21st meeting that you had. I thought Amy and Jeff did a great job kind of explaining the HOCO by Design initiative and what we're trying to achieve this time around. So for this presentation, I was going to focus more on the scenario planning component only of it. So next slide, please. And I know that there was some initial information that was provided to you at the 21st meeting, so I'm not going to repeat that. But really, just to reiterate or underline, our main push for including scenario planning in the general plan update is to look at options and to put those options side by side so we can measure impacts and evaluate the trade-offs. Now, this is nothing new to a lot of you who might be in the financial world or business world or those kind of things. You've been doing these scenario planning exercises a long time. It just took a little bit longer to catch up into local government, nationally speaking. So we're really just kind of doing the same thing, either confirming the path we're on is the right path by looking at options or looking at maybe some alternatives. Next slide. And so what we're doing as a consultant team is we're drawing on our knowledge. These are scenario planning projects we've completed in the last 5 years that supported a general plan update or a comprehensive plan update. And so what we're doing for this process is bringing that knowledge and that ability to look at different options and think about what if. And we're marrying that as a cohesive team with county staff who are going to be looking at fiscal impacts as well as other impacts to infrastructure and the like. We're actually building the capacity within Howard County and DPZ in order to continue this legacy after this project. And so really the validity or the belief that we have found with that experience that we just showed you is because we do a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach. So some of you who might be familiar with this exercise, you know that a lot of people take what's going on either nationally or at the state level and they try to apply it locally. We flip the script and we try to go from the bottom up. And so we build everything we do looking at how Howard County does its business, what are the conditions in Howard County. So we start by looking at the carrying capacity in terms of where are areas that are off the table to grow. And Jeff highlighted a lot of those in his presentation. We also code the development status. So where are things developed? Where are they preserved? Where might they redevelop? We go through a process called land suitability, where thinking like a developer or the market, site selection criteria folks, those kind of things. Where might growth want to go in the future because of the presence of certain conditions? We have what we call character areas, but these are like future land use categories that we can test different combinations and different intensities. And then ultimately we look at where the growth is going and again, measuring those impacts and evaluating the trade-offs of where you grow and how you grow. The other part that we do to kind of build confidence in the process is we acknowledge that we're not starting anew with a totally blank canvas. And so again, like Jeff presented, we'll be looking at a lot of the existing development and how that is performing and behaving throughout the county. We will look at that committed development or the pipeline development that Jeff reviewed. And then we're going to, our time to play, or where we do our fortune telling, is going to be with the area left to develop, whether it's undeveloped now, like the 2% or going up to the 8% because of re-subdivision potential, or if we do redevelopment. And so then we combine all of that in order to look at what the county's future might be long term. Now we are going to use a computer model for that. We're going to use a software called Community Viz, and it will allow us to look at multiple futures at one time. For those of you who think you know exactly how the county should move forward, we are going to look at least one more scenario and probably more in order to either confirm the path we're on or test a couple different ideas and alternatives. And those ideas and alternatives come out of our community engagement process, as well as some of the data and analysis that we've been uncovering. And it's all about measuring the impacts. So not just in Howard County, but in a lot of places we work, we talk about, what would it be like if we grew this way or that way, but nobody really knows. They just either pontificate or speculate. And so what we're trying to do here is put numbers to those growth options. So we'll be looking again at the impacts and evaluating the trade-offs in a host of categories, whether it's population growth, employment growth, different impacts to infrastructure, phases or aspects of quality of life. But probably most important in the next slide for this committee is we are going to be doing a fiscal impact analysis. And Jeff is going to lead that effort as a partner of the project team. And we're working with him closely to feed different development combinations, intensities, and patterns and seeing, well, what does that mean for the fiscal well-being of Howard County? So we're excited about that. So then I wanted to transition to kind of where the thinking is right now. And in full disclosure, we're sort of building the airplane while we're flying it. We don't have final concepts or anything to show with you today, but where things are going, we're really ramping up towards March when we'll be unveiling some of the ideas and options that we've put out there for the general plan. But first, I need to mention that what's embedded in these scenarios are these themes. And so one of the other big aha moments for this new general plan is that we're going to move away from what we call the siloed approach to chapters, where you have an environmental chapter and a housing chapter and a transportation chapter. And while each chapter is very sound and does its best to move the county forward, sometimes they actually conflict with each other, because the problems you're facing now, especially in a potential redevelopment phase of your growth, are very complicated, sophisticated, and need to have all topics on board at one time in order to solve your issues. And so we're moving in that route. We have Life Outdoors, which is combining the environment, recreation and parks, and community health. We have Quality by Design, looking at how things are done in the public and the private realm. Public realm being the investments the county makes, private realm being how development reacts to that and what they do to contribute to the future of the county. County in Motion is about transportation and moving people. So we're moving away from just moving vehicles to a move people approach. Economic Prosperity is looking at how we make Howard County more self-sustaining in terms of jobs and income from non-residential uses and activities. And how does housing and workforce and transportation and all that good stuff contribute towards putting the county in the best position forward. And then Dynamic Neighborhoods is all about housing and what residents need, whether it's schools or other quality of life issues and the like, are in the dynamic neighborhoods. Now, these are the 5 planning themes that are out right now. They're being presented as kind of the plate to react to. But if you go to the next slide, we actually do have a survey out right now that we would love for you and anybody viewing this video to partake in before February 8th, where we're looking for feedback. We may need to fine tune and refine those planning themes that went out for comment. So stay tuned to the final list, but we're waiting until the survey closes on the 8th to reveal that. Now, again, we have 4 scenarios that we've decided to look at for our event in March that we're calling our Growth Choices Workshop. As you can imagine, the combinations of things that are told in these stories could be limitless in terms of all the different ways you can look at it and the combinations. That experience that we showed you before has really honed in on about 4 scenarios, is about as many before there's confusion or maybe too much detail to be able to react to. So we've gone with 4 scenarios. These are 4 stories. We're going to highlight the story, but as important, the parts of the story, so we can react to all the different contributing factors and the like that go into these 4 different scenarios. And so, again, we'll be looking at it from many different viewpoints, as Jeff started to mention. In scenario 1, we're looking at the way the county is growing right now. It does have a limited capacity compared to what the market would like to do, or how much growth would like to come to the county. It does take into account the development on the 2% of the undeveloped land according to the zoning ordinance. It takes into account all of the pipeline development that we have coming in, the committed development, as well as some limited redevelopment potential as well. But this is really holding the course that you're on right now and taking it to its finality. In scenario 2, you see that while scenario 1 took direction from Plan Howard 2030, scenario 2 is taking even more direction, and it had in there targeted growth areas that were called out, but they were more general in terms of boundaries and things. And scenario 2 is looking for some very specific areas that might be appropriate for redevelopment or corridors to invest in, and the like, in order to find the places that Plan Howard 2030 can really still transform or influence. And so that scenario is a little bit more aggressive than scenario 1, so it's looking at more redevelopment potential that unlocks more capacity for growth, and therefore we're getting closer to meeting some of the market demands that are being identified for the county moving forward to a 2040 horizon. Scenario 3 is a what-if scenario, and it's saying, well, what if we really concentrate growth in fewer centers, which would allow them to become more dense or more urban, that would then really support the viability of transit as an option to move people long-term. And so that's something that we're looking at in scenario 3. In scenario 4, we're looking at sort of what happens if we really want to grow the county. And so we take sort of the advantages to growth, if you consider that an advantage, from the previous 3 scenarios and put it into scenario 4. And so again, as you're looking at these 4 scenarios, the existing 2% land, we're keeping the same for all of them. The committed development, we're keeping the same for all of them. The downtown Columbia, we're keeping the same for all of them. In scenario 2, 3, and 4, we're adjusting activity centers. We're really looking at Gateway as a primary growth area and what it might become in the future. And these are just 4 stories. And when we present these out for reaction, we'll be presenting them as the story as well as the parts of the story for reaction from the community. And then ultimately, it's not a set of 4 discrete choices based on what happens during the Growth Choices workshop in March, as well as other feedback we can get from components of our planning process for the new general plan. We'll create a hybrid. And that hybrid is going to be some combination and even new thinking in terms of what was reacted to from the 4 scenarios previous. The other thing the hybrid scenario is going to allow us to do is to go into more detail on some of the analysis on impacts and opportunities that will go before we get into a draft future land use map that will be included in the general plan. So the analysis that we show in March will be kind of sketch planning level and high level and start to get us in the right direction. And then the hybrid scenario, we're going to really get into details to look at the push-pull relationships of some of these choices left to be made. And then finally, I've been kind of hyping or promoting this Growth Choices workshop in March 2021. That's where we'll present these options for feedback and comment. It will likely or almost certainly be a virtual event because of where we are right now. We would hopefully find that you would want to participate in that, given your interest in the county. But also those of you who might also be part of the Planning Advisory Committee or some of those things, we'd like to have your input along the way and your perspective from the financial well-being of the county as we go through this process. So with that, again, I was more of the preview of coming attractions because we don't have a lot of data and numbers to share. I apologize about that, but they're coming in March and beyond as we get to the hybrid. But I think if you have questions for either myself, Jeff, or Amy Gowan is also in the meeting, and I'd invite her to respond as well.
Thank you very much, Matt and Jeff, and also Matt. Once you have the link of the dates for the workshop, please share with me. I'll be happy to pass on to the committee members there.
Great, thank you.
So we're opening to question now. So does anyone have question for either Matt or Jeff? I think you covered all their potential questions already. Possibly. All right. And for all the folks there, and also maybe a couple of them that cannot stay beyond 9 o'clock there, is that we are posting the video of the meeting at the county website there. So I'll send another email to the committee just to remind you about that. So you're not going to miss that. You can still go back and look at the video, and you also have the slides in shared folder for today's presentation. So please review. If you have questions, let us know. I want to thank again all our speakers today and thank everybody for staying with us this morning. All right, thank you. The meeting will be adjourned now. We're running a little bit late than usual, but there are a lot of very important information to digest and good discussion as well. Next week, by the way, we will start with the discussion among the committee about the key recommendations that you would like to include in this committee report that's due to the county executive on March 1st here. So stay tuned, and Steve, my vice chair, will be chairing the meeting next week. All right. Thank you all very much. Have a good one.
Thank you.